You to today's Medical Center Hour. This is actually the last Medical Center Hour in the 2011-2012 academic year. Welcome to all of you. I'm Marcia Day Childress from the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities, which produces these programs. And we've come to the end of our series of 21 programs for this year, and we will resume our programs in the fall on the 12th of September, and we hope to see all of you back again then. The human subject research landscape in the United States has altered dramatically since the early 1980s, when the current regulations governing research were formulated. The volume of research in both health services and social sciences is way up. Many studies now involve multiple sites, scores of investigators and reviewers, and thousands of participants. Many studies last several years. Clinical research in particular accounts for a burgeoning administrative infrastructure in medical institutions, and it's also acknowledged to be a key economic development engine for academic health centers. So there are many, many dollars involved. There are also new investigative tools such as imaging, informatics, and genomics, which have inflected research aims, methods, and conditions. So after 2 decades with all these changes socially and institutionally, is it time to update the federal rules protecting the persons who take part in research? If so, what revisions should be made and what impact will they have? Our Medical Center Hour today, entitled On Human Participation in Research, Rethinking the Common Rule, addresses the possible changes that the federal government is presently considering. To address this important subject, we're especially pleased to welcome today Dr. Jerry Menikoff as our speaker. With rigorous preparation in law, medicine, ethics, and public policy, and with experience in academic medicine and law, as well as in high-level government service, Dr. Menikoff is quite uniquely positioned to do what he does. He directs the federal government's Office for Human Research Protections, based in the Department of Health and Human Services. We're fortunate to have him here to lead us through this discussion of the revisions to the Common Rule, revisions that potentially will better protect research participants and also clarify and standardize investigators and IRBs' responsibilities and procedures. I'd like to say that we're most grateful to the University's Institute for Practical Ethics and Public Life for joining us in sponsoring this program. And I will turn things over to Jerry Menikoff and the dialogue with you that will fill our hour. Welcome.
Thank you, Marcia, for the generous introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here the second time. Certainly a wonderful institution, and I really feel privileged to be able to see all of you here. As was noted, I will talk a bit about the proposals that are out there in terms of perhaps updating the federal regulations protected research subjects. I suspect a lot of you already know a fair amount about these rules, so I'm going to actually try to be relatively brief, and hopefully we'll have a fair amount of time to discuss this after my remarks. On one topic in particular, in terms of informed consent, I will try to go a little beyond the sort of the dry stuff in terms of what the proposal is, to give you a sense of what people might be trying to get at. So, the usual disclaimer, these are just my views, and you probably, in fact, hear a lot of stuff that are just my personal views. What I'm discussing is a formal proposal on the part of the U.S. government, but unless I say otherwise, you're just hearing my views on all this. We've already actually gotten a fair amount in the introduction here in terms of why is this proposal out there. It's been 20 years since the Common Rule was adopted. A lot of the heart of these rules actually is a lot older than 20 years because it was decades before that, in fact dating back to the 1960s or so, that the rules were first, actually a lot of what's currently the rules was put in place. So it's been a while, and there really haven't been very, very many changes. As we've already heard, the nature of research has changed a lot. go back 20, 30 more years, you generally had studies that took place at one institution, at one site. It wasn't the big business it is today. You didn't have the big bucks involved that we now have. We have so many different ways of doing research these days. Probably, decoding the genome and being able to cheaply now do whole genome sequencing gives us a vast array of new types of doing research. So biomedical research involving specimens it's a huge growth area, raising all sorts of new issues. Even outside of pure biomedicine, the way we now have information science out there with the computers and just the number crunching, we could do stuff with the internet and other things that you learn amazing things about human behavior. And again, these are all types of studies we couldn't do years ago. So it really is a very, very different environment, and the rules didn't have any of this stuff in mind, because we could have probably even dreamed of this decades ago. Finally, we have experience with the rule. We have decades of knowledge about maybe parts of the rule actually don't work very well. Maybe other parts do work fairly well, but they could use a bit of tweaking. So the notion was, let's put this all together and let's see if we can actually improve things. So that's sort of what's behind it. I'm sure as a lot of you know, so this advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, which is the first stage in what can be a somewhat intricate process by which the federal government often changes regulations. The advance notice means you're sort of thinking about doing things, but in that document you don't actually spell out the specific regulatory changes. If it moved forward, the next step would be going public with a notice of proposed rulemaking. We just give it the advance at the start of it, and that notice would actually give you text of new proposed regulations, and that would also go out for public comment, and you would all have an opportunity to say what you like and what you don't like. So that would be the next step. The ANPRM had 7 specific topics that were put out there for consideration. Lots of questions. A lot of people are cynical about what the government is trying to do. Again, just my personal take here. Certainly most of us, the ones I'm familiar with, thought we were actually trying to improve things in terms of doing this. That can be harder than it seems. But we really were trying to do that. In particular, in terms of the number one goal in terms of this, it was actually to improve the well-being of subjects. Because you always get sort of cynics out there saying, well, it's sort of just the government getting together with moneyed interests to kind of eliminate the rules that make it hard for certain types of research to be done, et cetera, et cetera. And again, from the inside, we were genuinely trying to craft things that improve things. In particular, improve things in a way that subjects would be better off. And I'll try to highlight some of that stuff. One of the major themes in terms of making the subjects better off was the notion of maybe a fair amount of what we're doing is not very effective in terms of the notion that we have people, could be IRBs, researchers, others, spending time and effort doing things, and those things do not lead to a lot of increase in terms of human protections. So why don't we reduce the effort spent on that sort of thing and shift it toward things that sort of, give you more bang for the effort in terms of, again, improving the well-being of subjects. So that's the premise behind all of this. Again, you could think something will produce these wonderful results, and then you put it out for comment, and you get wonderful comments. And we have gotten wonderful comments. I suspect many of you have looked at the comments. If you haven't, I do suggest you look at them. I think I have a slide here. You could actually go to our website, or just, if you forget this slide, just Google OHRP, and one of the first URLs that pops up will be our website. If you get to our home page, there is a big blue button at the bottom of the page. You just click on the blue button. It will take you to a page that has clear and in plain language instructions on how to actually get regs.gov page, where it will actually let you quickly find all of the 1,100 comments. It actually is a very good system because you could actually search, full text search. So you could I mean, if you have a particular question, so I was mentioning earlier, so there were 70-odd questions in the ANPRM. And again, we're thrilled that so many people commented on it, so many organizations. I mean, it's sort of a who's who of major players in the research world. And as I was saying, if you haven't taken a look at the comments, take a look at them. I mean, I suspect many of these documents will play a major role in the future in terms of how we will move forward. And even apart from these particular ideas, many of them go into a lot of fascinating ideas. I mean, you have experts, for example, in internet research and sort of privacy, and people like Tanya Sweeney, if you know, who's a scholar now visiting at Harvard, who was famous for finding out the medical records of the governor of Massachusetts at one time, because they were basically public, but you didn't know who he was. But she demonstrated with 3 pieces of information, you could have quickly figured out who he was in a vast database that the state of Massachusetts made public. So, I mean, it's an interesting world we live in, and take a look at the comments if you haven't. It really is a good system. Okay, I am going to go through the 7 main topic areas, sort of one of these, top 10 countdown things. I'm going to start with number 7. I think it actually makes sense, just because actually number 1 is the more complicated, and that could really put you to sleep, so we can stay awake for a little longer. So number 7 is about harmonization. Harmonization is certainly, by and large, a good thing. I can certainly tell you, even apart from these rules, the 2 sets of rules that most people in the human subjects area have to deal with are the common rule, the part of it if you're dealing with health and human services that my office administers, and then there's the Food and Drug Administration. It has similar rules, but they're not identical. And that's a big deal to a lot of people, knowing the differences between the 2 sets of rules and knowing what you have to do to comply with both of them, if in fact you're under both rules, and for many of you, in fact, will often be under both sets of rules. But not only is there OHRP and the FDA, but there are 18 or so other federal agencies that follow the common rule. And these are some of the most significant research funders out there. And you ought, at times, it could be on one particular study you're under 2 sets of rules, or it could be you're a researcher that deals with education one day, or defense the other day, or you have research funded by both of them, for example. And so the issue this category was asking about is, should we be doing more to harmonize the guidance that the various common rule agencies are putting out there? And this was more of an open question, asking, well, are there a lot of differences, and are they very, very troublesome? Or maybe you'll conclude there aren't that many differences, or maybe there are a lot of differences, but the differences are not troublesome, and in fact may be appropriate. And I'm sure if, coming from the position, for example, of the Department of Defense, if any of you have done defense-funded research, they actually have rules that are significantly different in many ways, and they will, for good reason, say they have concerns. For example, they are responsible for research involving the people who defend this country. And maybe precisely because of these people putting their lives on the line in many other ways, there is a need for separate rules, add-ons to the common rule to protect those subjects. So there are both sides of this issue. And again, this was more an open-ended question about should we be doing more harmonization. Most of the commenters were actually in favor of increased harmonization. Not an incredibly surprising result there. Okay, number 6. Expanding the scope of the regulations. As I'm sure many of you are aware of, just because you are a research subject in a study in the United States, you are not necessarily under the common rule or any other federal regulations designed to protect human subjects. There are holes in the system. Some people may describe it as being somewhat Swiss cheese-like in terms of its coverage. You have to go through all these permutations to actually figure out in certain scenarios whether you are or are not under protected as a research subject by a version of these regulations. To actually fully change the rule to cover every subject in this country, it would probably require an act of Congress. The assumption behind the ANPRM was that what are the things we could do that don't require congressional action. So one possibility was you could actually cover more subjects by basically telling the institutions out there, hey, if you accept federal funding from a common rule agency to do human subjects research, by accepting that money, there's a quid pro quo. You basically are going to have to agree that not only are you going to apply the common rule to the federally funded research, but to all research at your institution. And that is actually a common way in which the federal government gets to enable institutions to follow things. You'll notice some of these issues are not that dissimilar to issues that were debated in front of the Supreme Court on legal grounds relatively recently, the way the federal government kind of partners with other entities, including sometimes other states. So the issue here was, this is one way to expand the scope of the rules. If you're familiar with the phenomena of checking the box, that is a purely voluntary step that institutions currently take, that they could basically already agree to say we're going to give jurisdiction and follow the common rule for all studies regardless of funding. This idea is basically saying, well, maybe we shouldn't make that voluntary. And by the way, in terms of this check the box phenomenon, it actually is the case right now that about 2/3 of the institutions out there do check the box. Again, getting back to sort of cynical stuff, years ago, a fair number of institutions probably thought bad things would happen to you if you didn't check the box. But I can assure you, nothing bad happens to you. It is purely an institution's choice whether or not I want to check the box. Yet, in many ways, it's kind of stunning that 2/3 of the institutions actually do that. Because by doing that, you're not just saying that you will follow the common rule on all those other studies, you're actually giving my office jurisdiction to go after you if you kind of don't do the right thing in terms of following the common rule. And I suspect that is an incredibly rare thing to happen these days. That by and large, we don't generally go out there and give the federal government jurisdiction to go after ourselves. Imagine if you, like, the IRS had no authority to kind of look into whether or not you paid your taxes correctly, and how many of us would then say, oh, I'd love to kind of just check a box and allow them to come after me if they didn't have it. But that's what 2/3 of the institutions in this country are doing. So it says a lot for them that they're actually willing to do that. So yeah, so that's number 6. Okay, number 5. Again, probably lots of you deal with reporting unanticipated problems. Which is the term that is used in the common rule. If you deal with FDA, there are certain types of adverse events that also have to be reported, again, on different time scales. The rules are admittedly complicated. That I think a lot of us would say they've been simplified over the last several years, but they still are complicated. And the goal of this idea for consideration was, could we do a number of things to improve this aspect of the system? One was, what about having one website where researchers will know? If you go there, it will have an electronic way for you to actually submit your adverse events. It will have little buttons you could click, so you could be submitting them to any relevant federal agency that otherwise has, some rules saying you have to report them. So make it easier for you. Also, there are very, very different rules all over the lot in terms of how you report many of these. NIH itself once put together a spreadsheet, and I think it ran like pages and pages and pages of the different internal rules that various institutes and centers at NIH apply. And there was like, for one center you have to report something within 1 week, for another 2 weeks, for another within a month, and then they have slightly different definitions. So the goal was, could you sort of harmonize a lot of this stuff and kind of get rid of some of these differences, make it easier on the researcher, make it a fairer system, and again, you just go to that one website and pour it all in there. The final point, which is sort of on the other side of it, is since we'll all pour in through this one website, one of the things that could be done is it would all go into a big database. And maybe by having that single database, you could actually do analyses of this data that would actually pick up stuff sooner than we're currently picking up, when, depending on who's funding your study, information on the same drug could be in 10 different places. So that is one of the things put out here under this number 5. Okay, data security, number 4. So certainly a lot of studies privacy, confidentiality, those sorts of issues, the notion of the researcher wanting to, well, having to protect information that somebody willingly gave them that is sort of not to be shared publicly, that could be a big issue. In many studies, it could be perhaps the biggest issue, certainly in a lot of social and behavioral research. Currently, the regulations require that attention be paid to this. It's not clear exactly how much attention each and every IRB is paying to this. So the notion was, and this gets back to one of those premises, sort of core premises of this set of proposals, are there better ways to allocate our time and effort? What about setting a sort of a floor such that you know that here are a bunch of reasonable rules. The goal in all of this stuff was to come up with rules that are reasonable. Reasonable rules that would say, when you're a researcher and you're collecting private identifiable information, here are the things you should be doing to make sure it doesn't accidentally become public. And if these rules are out there, maybe you wouldn't need the IRBs spending quite so much time worrying about this. And even apart from the IRB time, it also will set the floor. So you will know for every one of these studies. And this will also be a question of again, getting back to the theme of protecting the subjects. You are setting a standard that they will all know, every subject will know, hey, here's what we're going to do to protect, your privacy. So that's the notion here. Okay, number 3, improve informed consent. And this is the one, as I mentioned, I want to spend a bit of time on. Again, getting to this theme of protecting the subjects. The one thing that does the most in terms of protecting subjects is making sure they know what they're getting into when they enter a research study. There are a lot of rules out there. A lot of them are very, very complicated. For example, figuring out the appropriate balance between risks and benefits. That's a very hard rule to implement. And we have an interesting discussion, probably weeks of discussion, sort of how you kind of compare risks and benefits. They're very, very hard things to sort of balance. And it's unclear how much impact the rules actually have. But at least on the informed consent side, ultimately it's the subject who's going to be in the study. They should know what they're getting into. They should make an informed decision about whether or not this is really what they want. You go back to the Nuremberg Code, which still after 60 or so years really lays out in a great way the core principles. There's a reason it started with informed consent being number 1 of its 10 principles. There's a reason why that was the only one that's more than a sentence or so long, because this is sort of the key thing. Even if all the other parts of your rules aren't working very well, if you do a good job in terms of informed consent, you've done a huge amount in terms of protecting the subjects. They were told what they needed to know. They made, hopefully, in the words of the Nuremberg Code, an enlightened decision, having appropriate information. So that's a key thing. So we sit here recognizing all of this, and yet at the same time, perhaps acknowledging that in terms of problems with the system as it stands now, this is one of those areas that there is certainly substantial room for improvement. I'm sure, again, a lot of you have experience with looking at the sort of consent forms that are used these days. I'm going to give you some examples right now. What I'm particularly going to concentrate on are a few clinical trials, because I think the clinical trial area is the one, this is getting back to one of the themes behind these possible changes, that maybe, again, we're spending too much effort on the very, very low-risk studies and not enough effort on the higher-risk studies in terms of what we should be doing to protect the subjects. And that gets into how good a job are we doing in terms of informed consent in clinical trials. And if you've read the literature, there is a lot written in terms of the problems with informed consent. We have long, perhaps too long consent forms. They're complicated. They're not always at the appropriate readability level. And those are all very, very legitimate problems. What I'm going to particularly, I don't want to in any way diminish their importance, but I'm going to go through some other scenario in terms of examples I'm going to give you, and I'm going to suggest maybe there is perhaps an equally, troubling problem, namely, are we giving people the information they need to know? Or are we perhaps maybe dumbing down consent forms in a way that people don't get certain pieces of key information? And so, this is more a question for you to think about in terms of the consent forms you deal with, whether you think this is or is not a phenomenon to worry about. But anyhow, so the sense of this proposal was, can we do a better job in terms of improving consent forms? And on the federal government side, a lot of us think actually you can. This is not rocket science. We can actually change things here dramatically, because you hear many debates that say it's very, very hard to do, and maybe it isn't that hard to do. And maybe what you could do is change this document from being perhaps too close to, if you get the statements from your bank where once a year they send you their privacy policy or something, which these things are written for lawyers, and as a lawyer I can tell you I don't bother trying to read these things because you can't figure out what any of it means. That is not what the consent form is designed to do, and I must admit I'm troubled when you will get this in from plenty of researchers saying, look, I don't even worry much about the consent form. I worry about the process, I worry about the discussion of the subject. Well, that's not right. The consent form should disclose certain things in an appropriate way. It should be very readable. And I have to tell you, as a regulator, one of the key protections here is, I'm not trying to sort of denigrate researchers, but we don't know what's going to happen in the process. Until we're at a point where we're routinely videotaping what happens, I don't know whether the researcher is going to point out, hey, instead of being in the study, you could, if you want the new treatment arm of this study, you could actually get that from a doctor. And if you only have one shot at curing your cancer, maybe that's a better thing for you instead of a 50-50 shot at getting that new arm in this study. So I don't know if that discussion is happening during the process of informed consent. On the other hand, if information is in that consent form and it's very readable and it's something that the person actually has, then there is some responsibility on their part to actually at least attempt to read the thing, particularly if in the first or second page it clearly tells you, by the way, if the reason you're enrolling the study is because you want the new arm, there's only a 50-50 shot at getting into the study. You could probably talk a doctor into giving it to you, and maybe that's something you want to think about instead of being in the study. So, not hard to say that. Now, why we don't say it, well, that's an interesting question. So let me give you a few examples. But the goal is basically, let's rewrite these things to be a better, genuinely useful document that people could read and their eyes would open and say, oh, now I fully understand what it means to be in the study. So totally different from this notion of this legalese sort of thing. And again, I think this is doable. So let me just give you some examples. And the examples are here mainly to show you, I picked just a couple examples. These are studies that actually got a fair amount of attention, depending on how closely you follow the news in the human subjects area. And so they're not subtle studies in terms of, again, we try to pick examples that people are talking about. And these are studies that were multi-center studies that went through a lot of IRBs. And you can make of that what you want. Okay, so the first one is the tax study. Right, whenever you design a study, make sure you give it a good name. So, trial to assess chelation therapy. It was designed to test chelation with this compound called EDTA for treating coronary artery disease. As of 2006, there were about 111,000 people receiving this treatment. Actually, in the years prior to that, there were actually many more. But even, as of 2006, it's not that small a number of people that, if we actually have an issue about whether or not this stuff works, maybe, we want to find out more about it. So I think it's a fairly substantial number. It's worth paying attention to. The study was funded by NHLBI, the Heart, Lung, and Blood people at NIH, and it was jointly funded by NCAM, the Complementary and Alternative Medicine branch. It was started in 2003 until the present. They have currently already enrolled everybody in the study. They've, as far as more, I think they've all gone through the intervention, which I described to you, and they're now in the data analysis stage. As far as more, I think they're hopeful that relatively soon they'll actually have the results of the study, and I, for one, am actually interested in what I will say. Just in terms of the significance of this study, it's a $30 million study. I guess issues in terms of what you consider big bucks in terms of major league medical studies these days, but by any standard, certainly for NCAM, NCAM actually in general is not as well funded as some of the bigger entities, just due to the nature of what it studies. It's still a somewhat controversial area, complementary alternative medicine. So this was actually the biggest study that NCAM had ever co-funded as of the time it came out. So it's certainly a very significant study from the NCAM viewpoint. Fairly big study, 1,600 subjects, you had to be at least age 50, you had to have had a heart attack. So these were people with significant coronary artery disease. So what happened in the study, you were randomized to get either the EDTA, this compound I was talking about, and I'll tell you more about it, or a placebo. You were actually randomized in two separate ways, so it's what, 2 by 2. So you were on a separate level, you were randomized to either low or high doses of intravenous vitamins. And so the way the study actually worked, you got everything through IV infusions. It was done for about once a week for the first 35 weeks of the trial, and then I switched to something like once a month for about the last 5 weeks. I'm not going to say a lot about the risks. Some people claim there were very substantial risks. As studies go, I don't think the risks were incredibly huge. On the other hand, there's certainly a lot of time and effort involved on the part of the subject. You're going for these intravenous infusions that took an hour or so, weekly for quite a bit of time. There's a legitimate issue in terms of expectations and what we call in the legal area reliance interests, that if the subjects, by being in this trial, thought something very good was happening to them, perhaps in terms of decreasing their risk of getting coronary artery disease, that they might therefore not have paid as much attention as they could to known factors that they could reduce in terms of cutting back on smoking or fat consumption and exercise and all those good things. That we actually have a lot of good information that really genuinely do reduce the risk of getting coronary artery disease. But just be aware in terms of, again, the EDTA placebo, in terms of the main drug intervention that this study was about, half of these people were actually coming for each of these weekly IV infusions and basically getting salt water, saline, pumped into them. So again, it's sort of a big commitment in terms of the placebo arm here. So let me tell you a little bit about the consent form, and as I tell you this, I'll try to also tell you a little more about what was involved in the study, sort of background for why you're doing the study. And this is pretty much verbatim from the consent form. I think it's a pretty usual consent form as clinical trial consent forms go. It noted FDA has approved chelation for lead poisoning, but not as a treatment for heart disease, and that is totally correct. Chelation had been out there, EDTA had been out there for many, many years. It is the standard treatment given, in particular, children who eat paint off the walls and get too much lead in their bodies. EDTA is the sort of chelating agent of choice. And again, it's not even totally benign in depending on how young the child is. But if you get too much lead, you give the child EDTA. So it strips your body of certain types of minerals. So the notion was, well, by stripping your body perhaps of other minerals, they may be minerals that build up into the walls of your arteries and cause the clot-making stuff to break off. So maybe by chelating the stuff using EDTA, you reduce the risk of having heart attacks and strokes. This was a big deal, and I'll tell you more about why it was a big deal for certain types of doctors. It had been practiced in the community for many years. Again, I'll tell you more about it, but remember, at least 100,000 or so people getting it in 2006, many more than that even before that. So that was certainly true. Now, the third bulleted sentence, however, like with chelation therapy, there is no evidence that high-dose vitamin and other supplements are beneficial for patients like you. So this is a fairly standard consent form, and I think I have the papers, right? Okay, 12 pages long. So going back to that, That was the only sentence in the consent form that told you what we actually knew about using chelation therapy and EDTA for treating, reducing the risk of coronary artery disease. And you might ask yourself, is that enough? And notice in this sentence, it's not even the major clause. It's like the aside. It's mainly talking about the vitamins, but it's throwing in, well, as with the vitamins, we actually don't have any evidence that this stuff actually works. Well, what do we actually know about this stuff? Okay, so we didn't. Okay, so one other sentence that they note. If you're assigned to the chelation group, you will receive a standard intravenous mixture established by the American College for Advancement in Medicine. So they're reassuring to you that we should get the standard mixture. Sounds like a good thing. Okay, so let me tell you. So that group is a thing called ACAM. And let me tell you a little about ACAM. ACAM actually came into being decades ago for the purpose of bringing together doctors who were giving this treatment, using EDTA for chelation. And they actually it was a fairly good business because insurance didn't pay for it, so people had to give you cash ahead of time, and you basically got to keep all of it. You didn't have to deal with insurance companies and different rates for different insurance companies, et cetera, et cetera. I think the general going rate, at least recently, is like at $100 a treatment for each of these IV infusions. You have to get around 40 or 50, so you're talking about $4,000, $5,000. It could be a pretty good supplement to your income if you have enough patients who are willing to kind of do this. So these doctors sort of got together to talk with each other and figure out better ways to kind of, advertise the treatment, recruit patients, et cetera, et cetera. That was what ACAM was. It actually had a different name then it sort of changed its name. Even the first name that wouldn't have in any way hinted to you that the group was about chelation doctors using this for cardiac disease getting together. But that's what they were doing. Finally, in 1998, there was actually a complaint lodged with the Federal Trade Commission, and actually ACAM entered into a settlement agreeing that it would no longer promote this. Apparently, what it was promoting was it was claiming the stuff was safe, effective, and low cost. Now, I guess you could debate about the low cost. I guess you could even debate how safe it is. It's not incredibly risky, but as to whether or not it's effective, there's a great deal of doubt about its being effective, and so they did enter into a settlement agreement. What I find fascinating is this group actually, again, is very, very organized these days. And it has conferences in Las Vegas and different places like that. If you're a person who wants to give this therapy as a physician, they actually have a course that will teach you how to give it. You can actually get certified. So you can become a certified chelation therapy provider, and even one of these, icon logo things they can put on your letterhead and on your advertising, which I think is quite fascinating, given that we don't actually know that the stuff works, and in fact they entered into a settlement agreement with the federal government. So what does it mean to be a certified practitioner of stuff that we can't even acknowledge whether or not it works or not? Anyhow, so organized medicine from the early days of this has actually rejected this and basically gone out of its way. So it's not as if organized medicine actually rejects every single alternative treatment. I think a lot of things were open-minded about it, but they certainly rejected this. And I don't give you a lot of details here, but the bottom line is you could have a who's who of the American Academy of Cardiology or College of Cardiology, the AMA, all these groups have position papers out there saying this stuff is bogus. Missouri, a bunch of states actually go out of their way on the clinical side and say, we don't like this stuff. And Missouri is great because what Missouri does, it's fascinating, is they will say that to a doctor, you can't give this to your patients as clinical care unless you have a special consent form signed. And that consent form will go through in detail how bogus this stuff is. It will even announce that the official position of the state of Missouri is that it's bogus and we shouldn't get it. But on the other hand, if the person reads that and signs it and still wants it, that's fine. But it is very upfront about this, so I'm just putting it out there. It's interesting in terms of the research consent form. It has, like, I told you, the one sentence that tells you about this stuff. Might it actually then, in fact, reassures you that you get the standard treatment endorsed by the American Academy or whatever it is. So, just a question, are there details missing here? And I'm raising a broader theme. How common is it that we have these generic consent forms, that we have the one sentence that says, we're not sure whether this works, not giving any of the background? give you one more example, the Tide study. Another good name, Tide, maybe it reminds you of Tide detergent and all the other good things. Okay, so no, this study got a huge amount of attention, not specifically for the issue I'm raising. So it was to determine if Avandia. So what Avandia was used for, it was used for treating diabetics, didn't actually do much with your blood sugar. What it was actually designed to do was to somehow prevent one of the major side effects from having diabetes, namely, coronary artery and other arterial disease, so that you would end up getting strokes and heart attacks and, again, similar bad things. And the concern was that we had discovered that perhaps actually this stuff isn't that good in terms of treating this stuff. And in fact, not only would it not reduce these risks, it might actually increase the risks. So that's sort of a bad thing if the drug you're taking to decrease heart attacks and strokes actually increases your risk, something you probably want to worry about. So FDA actually learned about that and said, well, gee, maybe we ought to have a study to resolve this issue. Huge study, 16,000 subjects in 30 countries who were randomized to Avandia, another drug of the same class, or placebo. The consent form, it notes the drug manufacturer analyzed the data. The results suggest it may increase your chance of heart attacks, but other studies have not confirmed this. Again, that's all I wanted to tell you about this, okay? Now, they had 9 pages that say other stuff, so it wasn't as if they didn't have a paragraph or two they might have squeezed in there. So might they have said anything else? So here's a little more about the study. The reason this study is being conducted was because there was an important article in the New England Journal of Medicine, a meta-analysis of the Avandia data. It was actually using the data that the drug company actually voluntarily put out there because it entered into a settlement agreement on other data. Foolish of them to actually release this data. A leading, very eminent U.S. cardiologist analyzed the data and found that there were troubling results. And what he concluded actually was that over 7 years, your risk of a heart attack if you used a drug would increase by about 50%. This was a big deal. And you could ask yourself, well, a 50% increase over 7 years, that might be a big deal to you. This made front page headlines in the New York Times. The stock price of the drug company, and this was a major pharmaceutical maker, so it's not like it's a company that this is the only drug. This was huge for it to cause an 8% drop in your stock price. I mean, this is mind-boggling. So the stock price dropped. So bottom line, should that consent form have said a little bit about this stuff? I mean, the odds are if you read occasionally the New York Times, you would have known more about the issue than if you read the consent form. And we're back to kind of okay. And did IRBs do much about this? Again, this went through many, many IRBs. I didn't actually remind you in the earlier study, the tax study, that went through a whole bunch of IRBs. And by and large, they didn't do a lot in terms of changing it. So I think, so that's all I have to say about the general consent form issue. Okay, one other point. So getting back to my laundry list, which I will finish soon, of the changes. One of the things being considered is written consent for biospecimen use, even if they're de-identified, even if they're clinically collected biospecimens. Instead of using them now without consent, maybe people should have the right to say yes or no to that. They wouldn't have to be done on a study-specific basis, so somebody could sign a form when they enter into an institution saying, I agree that all of my biospecimens could be used for a whole bunch of studies, and you don't even have to bother me with telling me each time what the study is designed to look into. So. Okay, category number 2, multi-site studies. Remember, we have lots of multi-site studies these days. Didn't have nearly as many of them decades ago. Well, what about the notion of instead of having all these IRBs, multiple IRBs reviewing the study at every site, maybe it would be a good thing to have one IRB of record. And so you might say, well, will this have watered down things? Instead of having all these wonderful 50 separate opinions, we'll have one. Well, on the flip side, what maybe happens now is that each separate IRB doesn't have the authority to actually change much of anything, so all they do is drop out as a site for that study. This IRB will, in fact, have power, because if they say no and say, you have to rewrite the consent form this way, the study isn't going to get done. So that's the theory. This would just be done on the domestic sites of multi-site study. Okay, so here's the final category, and this is some detailed changes in how IRBs function, the goal of better targeting level of review to the risk of the study, a number of changes in terms of expedited review. Continuing review, the default would be you do not need continuing review, but the reviewer could say this study does need continuing review. Fine, but it's their call. Default would be a study is minimal risk if it otherwise meets the needs of the expeditable category, but again, the reviewer could say it should be determined to be more than minimal risk and therefore should go to a convened IRB. Again, allowing the reviewers to actually figure this stuff out. Finally, should their approval criteria be the same for expeditable studies as for the higher risk studies? So that's a question. In terms of number of proposals in exempt research, the registration form would be filed and basically would sort of almost direct the researcher in terms of answering fairly straightforward questions that would lead to a determination it is or is not exempt. Once the study is filed, the registration is filed, you can begin your study, and it would eliminate the current suggestion that there has to be a review of almost all these studies by somebody other than the investigator. Again, this notion of maybe these are low-risk studies and we're spending too much time on them. It would also expand the type of studies that can be exempt, including studies that involve collecting identifiable private information. As long as it's a competent subject, they can decide if they want to give you private identifiable information. It would require data security protections for those, and this is just describing that expansion. Also, the proposal should include some degree of social behavioral studies to be exempt, even if they have an intervention, and it's a very benign type of intervention. And you also could exempt certain types of secondary research with biospecimens and data. So, okay, I'm ready for questions. Sorry, I didn't give as much time.
Okay, it's your turn. As you can see, Jerry Menikoff is amazingly conversant with the issues on this, and in a sense, we've brought him here so that you have the opportunity to ask your questions, register some of your comments with him. So I will ask that when you ask a question, please identify yourself.
Thank you. I'm Dennis Templeton, Chair of Pathology. Many of the specimen-based activities that we do now that require long-term follow-up or rare diseases require the use of bank archived specimens. You mentioned it only briefly. If we had to obtain consent for that, which we're willing to do prospectively,
Right.
would there be an exemption for the years and years of data?
Yes.
that have passed?
A question was asked about that, but the starting premise was that there would probably be grandfathering. It's unreasonable to, there were different rules in place up until now, so a lot of this stuff is incredibly valuable, and people are thinking that would not be a good thing in terms of balancing the beneficence and the benefits we all get from using that type of class specimen. Sure, they would grandfather.
I'm Lois Shepard from the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities, and you spoke about the open-ended consent form that could be used in the future for biospecimens. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you see the risks for future, that might be involved in future research on biospecimens, and then how those risks might be described, because we're talking about research studies that aren't yet designed.
Sure. So in terms of what are the risks of those studies, I mean, I think in general, most people think the biggest risk is a privacy risk, that some particular piece of information that you want kept private becomes public. There is, I'm not sure you described it as a risk, but there's always the autonomy issue, namely there could be a study taking place that had you known about it, you wouldn't want that study to take place, and then you study a particular issue that you were morally opposed to, that sort of thing. I think those are the major risks that people talk about. And that was the premise behind, therefore, since these risks are fairly generic, you actually could describe them in the generic consent form. It is very different than being in a clinical trial, where what happens to you is unique to that clinical trial. Taking a biospecimen and doing stuff with it in the lab, again, is a fairly generic activity. Some people may just object to it. They may object to the government or government-funded entities doing that sort of research. But a lot of people are probably fine with it and don't have to know what's going to happen in a particular study. But it would sort of describe those risks and any other risks if people would come out and in terms of comments, tell us other risks that described. Again, we're certainly happy in terms of making that an appropriate consent form that lays out what people think are the risks.
Jim Tolbert, Institute of Practical Ethics and Public Life. Jerry, you've read through all those responses, and you're very familiar with the issues in the federal government for getting changes in something like the Common Rule. What are the major challenges that you see that you and your colleagues will have to face now in actually moving this toward a final rule? That'd be one part of the question. The second part, in response to the advance notice of proposed rulemaking, were there any surprises in the responses you got that after you and your colleagues developed this, were there some things that in terms of the challenges that were offered by respondents that you found surprising?
Okay, yeah. Okay, so in terms of sort of what happens next sort of thing, well, we have the comments. We are in the process of analyzing the comments. Lots of groups within the federal government are looking at the comments. It is a challenge. It's not as a cookie cutter method for putting this stuff all together and figuring out the right way to go, unless we sort of get into part of your second question. What I've discovered, because I'm fairly new to all of this stuff, sort of haven't been on the academic side before previously, it is actually very, very complicated to kind of craft policies that are no-brainers in terms of that they actually work. The real world is messy, and people's behavior is messy, and the costs of doing things in our world currently are very, very huge. And a lot of that actually came out in the comments, and what the goal is of the federal government, again, is to look at these comments and think about all of the things we're trying to do, and ultimately synthesize it all into kind of improvements in terms of what we might propose going forward. Other than sort of saying it's complicated, next steps, as I indicated, would be assuming everything goes forward and the goal, the desire remains that, yes, the government wants to proceed with some sort of change. Again, it may not be exactly what was originally proposed. There would be a notice of proposed rulemaking. We're in the middle of all that now, and so it's a work in progress. So I've already identified some of the stuff in terms of what's surprising. I mean, I guess partly also was somewhat surprising, a lot of the comments were fairly negative. And I guess they were more negative than they thought. And a lot of them were also sort of harshly negative in terms of almost, again, being cynical that, kind of not really trying to improve the system. And all I would say is from our side, or my side, is it actually, it may sound easier on your side, but even people of goodwill are actually trying to change things. To give you one example, which got a lot of comments, the one part of this rule that actually got a fair amount of public publicity in sort of the lay media, we got one story in the New York Times, and it was the exact opposite of what I ever would have predicted, which was social and behavioral researchers, the people who use sort of data, complaining that this proposal would have made it harder for them to do their work, because allegedly it would have turned stuff that is currently publicly available into now being considered private identifiable information. And this was by a New York Times reporter who had made the same complaint in a story like 7 years ago. And by my take, I would have thought actually a major theme of the NPRM was actually probably going to be helpful to the social and behavioral research people. So on the one hand, the media was sort of saying, well, no, you're making that worse. The other side of it you got were a lot of institutions complaining about that registration requirement, that by allowing a researcher to immediately start the research, horrible things would happen because then you'll discover that it really wasn't exempt. And so it's sort of like there's no way, even on the stuff that we as the government were saying, look, you don't have to review each and every one of these. They're low-risk studies. You're not going to get sued, which is true. I mean, we're discussing this separately. There is so little in the way of lawsuits, even on the research studies that actually people probably should be suing. I mean, bad things happen to them. They're certainly not suing on these benign social behavioral ones. Yet many institutions, it's like, what a horrible idea that you're going to kind of encourage us to allow these researchers to start in these benign studies without giving us an opportunity to review the studies. So even if we eliminated our recommendation, and that's all it is, that you should review each of these to determine that it's exempt, it's like, I don't know that it's going to change anything. And so it's almost like, even on the federal government side, there's not a lot we could do to eliminate what some people see as an overly burdensome system, somehow created by a system in a way that you can't undo it. I mean, unless we had an authority, and believe me, there are some people who actually suggest this, to like say, it is illegal for you to like use your IRB or an administrator to review this study, which we're not about to do that. We're not about to say that you can't try to do that. So, I mean, those are the sorts of things that it was interesting.
Can you say something about the possible use of children in human experimentation and whether these rules in any way address that?
Yeah, okay, so the rules intentionally do not deal with the vulnerable population issues. Those issues are by and large in the system dealt with in the subpart B, C, and D. I want to make it clear, there are huge issues in terms of children in particular. There are lingering issues in the fact that we don't have any rules that say anything about incapacitated adults. And it was more that it would be a huge challenge to deal with those rules, which are very, very complicated, and the solutions to a lot of the problems that have been highlighted are not obvious. So that's sort of a separate piece to be dealt with elsewhere. So the only changes that this part of it, what's described in the ANPR would make to those rules would be conforming changes, but not specific changes to deal with the subparts. Again, that was an intentional decision, just because it was sort of like, we were happy that we were at least able to get the ANPRM out there, which might have been considered miraculous by some standards.
We've considered asking patients who are admitted for treatment for consent for use of their specimens and that sort of thing for research. One of the issues we have there is whether the very act of asking for them is a coercive act. Have you considered whether it's even possible to get uncoerced consent from a patient entering for medical care?
Okay, so I mean, that's an interesting issue. I mean, in a sense, that's getting to the heart of all the consent for participating in research, right? You have the same issue with a clinical trial. And people raise, it is a legitimate problem. How bad a problem it is, I don't know. I mean, you've probably seen it again. If you really want to deal with it, this is getting back to that complicated issue of how much do we devote in terms of resources to certain things. You would have people distinct from, certainly from your physician, being the ones who sort of enroll you in the study. Ideally, there would be some sort of, ombuds person who has nothing to do with the study and is not getting paid based on how many people enroll in studies, and they would in fact do a good job of doing that. One of my pet ideas, if I ever end up hopefully at some point at a university again, would be to actually, being from sort of the legal academic world and the medical academic world, I suspect a lot of law students, they're looking for clinical stuff. I think it'd be great to pair somebody being asked to be in a clinical trial with some budding law student who could sort of advise them. And this would be a very energetic student who would read about all this sort of stuff and try to find out what the consent form is actually saying and tell you whether or not it's a good thing or not for you to be in the study. And that would be sort of neat. But it's a great question. And there is a problem there. It's a hard one to solve.
Anybody else have just a quick closing question? Okay, that's all right.
Maybe a suggestion. I've seen
Sure.
several groups struggling with data security.
Okay.
It's hard to do as an individual or a small group. A suggestion might be that that's something that could be done centrally, and if your office or something else could contract a data cloud or something that could
Okay.
be useful, that has the security that we really need, that would be a big
Okay.
resource.
Thank you.
So we've ended on a suggestion. Please join me in thanking Jerry Menikoff for